Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Should Bible-believing Christians support Israel? Well, what does that look like as Americans? Does that have anything to do with what we say, how we react to what's going on in our culture? What about the madness at the university level on college campuses? What about how we vote in a big election coming up in November? Does that have anything to do with us supporting Israel? Well, Christians have a voice, and I'm so excited to talk about this with Jeff Myers today. I want to bring him in. Dr. Jeff Myers, president of Summit Ministries, a Colorado-based nonprofit that equips and supports this rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. And man, if there's a generation that needed to be reached with the truth and to be brought up and taught the biblical worldview, it's this one. Evangelist Josh McDowell called Jeff Myers a man who is 100% sold out to preparing the next generation to reflect the character of Christ in the culture. We've had Sean McDowell on this show. These guys are just such a blessing to us. But Jeff Myers, thank you so much for your time today. And the brand new book, Should Christians Support Israel? Very relevant. Thank you.
At the end of the show, we're going to talk about how everybody watching or listening right now can get a copy for free of that book, because it's such an important message. We want folks to read it and then recommend it to their churches, small groups, other people. I just heard of a big Bible study that's taking place in a Midwestern city where they're looking at this book for several weeks in a row because it's such a critical topic. And it tells us not just about what's going on in a little strip of land in the Middle East, but what's happening everywhere all the time. About everything. The United States, what is our role? What is Western civilization? All of those kinds of things. And why is this rising generation so indoctrinated?
We're going to talk about all that today and get as much as we can out of you in the short time we have. But guys, get it and get it fast. Summit.org, and Jeff is going to tell you exactly how to get your copy, but we've got to move fast on this. We're losing a generation. But let's start, Jeff, with your recent trip. I don't remember how recent it was that you went over to Israel. You saw some of the destruction, the towns, the military bases where Hamas struck, and you called it a sobering experience. So let's start right there, and we'll get to the book after that.
Yeah, well, let me give just 60 seconds of background. At October 7th, 2023 was the worst day in Israel's history since 1948. 1,200 civilians who were killed, mutilated, raped, tortured, 250 hostages taken. And we can't even picture the level of devastation for a tiny country of 9 million people of what that was like. Well, it propelled Israel into war with Hamas, which is a terrorist group. And I thought, oh, well, clearly American young people will side with the Jewish people because they were attacked. But they didn't. They sided with Hamas. A Harvard poll in December of 2023 said that 60% of Gen Z said they thought Hamas's attacks were justified because of Palestinian grievances. So I got upset and wrote an opinion editorial piece for Daily Wire called "Congratulations, America, You've Raised a Generation of Terrorist Sympathizers." Well, that led to an opportunity to join a small group of leaders to actually go to the war zone to find out firsthand what is taking place. And needless to say, what is actually taking place on the ground is not what we are hearing about in the news. I've been in a war zone before. This is the first one I've been to where you can literally get up in a nice hotel in the morning, have breakfast, and then drive to the war. It was about a 90-minute drive from Jerusalem to Gaza. And you realize instantly what's going on, because at a certain point, the roads all become very rough because tanks have been transiting the roads. You can see the smoke arising from terrorist hideout targets in Gaza over here. And then on the other side, you hear the artillery going off and you realize you're literally right in the middle of it. So obviously, it's dangerous. There are bomb shelters dotting the highways, just like bus stops on streets in the United States. And they tell us that we have 7 seconds. If there's a rocket attack, which there almost always are rocket attacks from Gaza, if there's a rocket attack, you have 7 seconds to take cover. So we're issued all of our protective gear, the Kevlar helmets and vests. And then we actually began the day, a day of exploring, talking to people, looking at the homes that were destroyed, just the devastation of these terrorists, the devastation to the agriculture, even to the military outpost that is in that part of southern Israel. But mostly we just listen, David. And I think that's the important thing. Israelis in that part of the country have been under attack for so long. They have been in pain for so long. And what they get from Americans is lecturing about their moral inferiority, lectures about everything they're doing wrong. And they just needed someone to ask, how are you doing? What can we do to help you? How are you feeling? What happened to you on that day? What are your memories? What are your fears? All of those kinds of things, just to show that we cared. But when I came back, and I'll end with this because I know there are a lot of other questions, I knew I had to do something. I've written a lot of books, but I knew this one had to be written. I didn't provide for that. I didn't I didn't factor that into my year, but I just knew somebody's got to tell the truth about what is really taking place, especially to Christians who were wavering in what position they should take.
And thank you, Jeff. That is due to the biblical illiteracy we see. I mean, Barna and all the research you see come out on this in America, the biblical literacy is off the charts. So people don't understand the biblical worldview. So to those of us keeping score or that are informed, we understand why. But I think, like you, all of us, or most of us, were surprised when we saw the protests on our soil, on our college campuses, and them chanting things that they didn't even understand. The mob mentality. They were chanting about the river to the sea, not knowing what river, right? By the way, I saw you recently, a part of Liberty Pastors, and I saw you do an interview with Paul Blair, and great men and women of God are part of that organization. But I've got some quotes that you shared. Let's start with the biblical worldview, because you said in that interview, this is not a geopolitical issue in and of itself. There's more to it, and we've got to go back to the Bible because there's so much ignorance out there. Go ahead.
I think of this as a theopolitical rather than a geopolitical conflict. If a conflict is geopolitical, it's about land. You can exchange land, give a few acres here, take a few acres there, and if someone is offended, you can write them checks. And you can solve a lot of problems that way. America does this kind of thing all of the time in the world to secure our allies and our trading partners. But in a theopolitical conflict, you can't really understand what is going on if you don't understand the worldviews that are at play. So we need to understand, what is a Christian worldview of Israel? How does that relate to Judaism? What is Judaism? Is it just a religion, or is it a culture, or what? And then ultimately what Islam teaches, because the central attacks that are taking place against Israel right now are religiously motivated, not by the world community of Muslims, but by a very small group of Muslims who believe that everybody who's ever been born was born Muslim. If you're not Muslim now, then you are in rebellion against Allah, and you must be forced by military means to cease your rebellion against Allah. That is what the Quran repeatedly calls for, and it's called jihad. So you have people who take that command literally, and they will never give up as long as they draw breath. They believe, in fact, what God requires of them is to die, if necessary, in the attack on anyone who fails to submit to Allah as they see fit.
By the way, we've got to squeeze in something here. We're talking about Israel and the importance of Christians supporting Israel. But we know this is demonic at its core. It's spiritual, as you just said. It's a theological issue too, primarily. And they're going to go after, if you have that ideology, the Islamic ideology, they're going to go after the Jews. But Christians aren't immune. They're going to come after Christians as well. You just said that. Anyone who goes against their warped worldview and their conquest, their jihad, am I correct in saying that?
You're correct in saying that. What we call anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews and of an unwillingness to protect Jewish interests as a people group. And so it depends on the time in history. There have been times in history where it was Christians, not Muslims, who were committing most of the atrocities against Jews. the greatest attacks against Jews came through the Enlightenment Darwinian ideal that Jews are inferior people and need to be eliminated from the population. And that wasn't just Adolf Hitler, by the way. That was almost the entire leadership of the nation of Russia as well, who committed those atrocities. And 6 million European Jews were killed during World War II. Well, that led to the establishment of the modern nation of Israel, which I believe is a continuation and a fulfillment of God's prophecies from the Old Testament. But it just depends. It seems like whatever the cultural zeitgeist is, it tends to produce anti-Semitism. Well, Christians now know this. We're aware of this. And it's a major failing on our part if we fail to understand God's role for the Jews and fail to protect them at this time.
So one of the points I received in preparing for this interview is talking about back to the college campuses. I think a lot of us were surprised that there was, I guess, so much ignorance, but that they would go right along with this and support Hamas. They're against Israel. And so the anti-Semitism really, really stuck out when we weren't expecting that in our country. Jeff, before we take a brief break, could you care to comment on that?
I'd be happy to. We trained our children to stand up against bullies and to not be bullies. What we didn't know is how the education system and social media would weaponize that belief and turn it into an oppressor versus oppressed mindset. So whoever the professors say the oppressors are, any means may be rightfully used to against them. And it would be considered self-defense, not terrorism. That is what young adults have been conditioned in this country to believe.
And you mentioned oppress and oppress, and another quote I got from that video that I watched with the Liberty Pastors that you did, unity is never the goal of a Marxist agenda, it's conflict.
Right.
And we see that in America though too. We see that they're dividing Marxism, cultural Marxism, but we want to mention the book again, guys. Should Christians support Israel? And this is hugely important right now in this cultural moment, seeking a biblical worldview in an impossible situation, from Dr. Jeff Myers. And you can go to the website summit.org. We'll be right back on Worldview Matters.
Introducing Patriot Mobile, the wireless carrier that stands with you. We are committed to supporting the values that make our nation great. With affordable plans and reliable nationwide coverage, Patriot Mobile is not just a wireless service. It's a call to action for those who believe in the American dream.
Get free activation now with promo code DAVID. Friends, if you know someone who might be interested in sponsoring Worldview Matters, send our producer an email, worldviewmatters@fpeusa.org, our website, worldviewmatters.tv. We're with Dr. Jeff Myers and the book, Should Christians Support Israel? Well, the answer is yes, and you can read more about it in the book, but I think there's a lot of ignorance about biblical history, world history, and that God still has a plan for Israel, regardless of what America does, by the way. Would you care to speak to that, Jeff, before I get to another question?
I would like to speak to that. And I think it's important to point out that when I say support Israel, I do not mean ignore the plight of beleaguered Palestinians. What I mean is that you support Israel's right to exist and its right to defend itself. You recognize that Hamas is the enemy, both of Israel and of the Palestinian people themselves.
Yes.
And that as Christians, that God's not done with the Jews. There is a plan that he is working out with the Jewish people, a covenant that began long, long ago with a guy named Abraham, that continues on today, and Christians have the privilege of being grafted in. But in that sense, we are brothers and sisters with our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Jeff, can we talk briefly about, I don't know, maybe you can call it a cancer in the church, one of the things that some people have fallen for, and that is replacement theology, that the church replaces Israel. And this is just dangerous. It is false. And yet a lot of people have fallen for it in our churches in our country. And how concerned are you about that? And what can we do about that?
What we call replacement theology is what theologians usually call supersessionism. And there's kind of a soft supersessionism and a hard supersessionism. Theologians never make anything very simple. But the basic idea is that because of Jesus Christ, Christians now have replaced the Jews as God's church, as God's people. And so rather than seeing Christians as being grafted into God's root, people who are supersessionist believe that Jews essentially are irrelevant to God's plan at this point. Now, a hard supersessionist would take a very strong position and say, essentially, Jesus died as a Jew, yes, but he rose again as a Christian, and Jews are not relevant to God's plan anymore. And they point to a number of passages where the Apostle Paul expressed great irritation at the particular Jewish people who were attacking his ministry and even trying to kill him. But the soft supersessionist would probably be more likely to say, I support Israel politically, but from a faith perspective, it's about Jesus now, not about the Jewish people. I think that's a problem because I think it misunderstands the nature of the covenant. If you go back to Abraham, covenant's a very serious agreement that you seal with your life. And when Abraham and God were preparing to make a covenant, Abraham sacrificed animals, divided the carcasses, and the two parties to a covenant were to walk in between, essentially saying, if I break this covenant, may what was done to these animals be done to me. Then God pulled a fast one on Abraham. He put Abraham into a deep sleep, and God alone walked through the pieces. So we call it the Abrahamic covenant, but technically it's God making a covenant with himself on behalf of Abraham. And from that point forward, it was always from the Jewish people or from God through the Jewish people to the nations of the earth. The important thing I think that a lot of people ignore is that this is a physical reality. The covenant in Scripture is always in the passages that I've examined anyway, there might be one or two stray ones. It's always related to the land. It is God's covenant with the people in the land, with the people in the land. And the land is so central and so important to God that when he admonishes the Jewish people for being disobedient, he says, the land itself will vomit you out if you disobey me. But then there's also a lot of prophecy in the book of Amos, which I was just reading this morning, a prophecy of Jews from all over the earth being called back into the land. Now, why is that so significant? Because people who are supersessionists believe that the Jewish people or God's chosen people or the covenant people, that is a spiritual metaphor, that Israel is only a spiritual metaphor. It doesn't refer to a physical place. That is not what Scripture teaches. And I can understand why they would do it in the time of John Calvin, Martin Luther, and so forth. Israel didn't exist as a physical place because the people had been conquered by Rome and dispersed throughout the world. But now that it does exist again as a physical place, we need to be looking at our theological categories and making sure they account for what's actually happening.
Wow. And I'm thinking about 1948, how miraculous that was. The birth of a nation. Isaiah talks about that. Can a nation be born in a day? Yes.
Yeah, it literally can. And it's happened 3 times. Israel was first formed in the Exodus, and then second was reformed after coming back from captivity in Babylon, and now I believe is formed a 3rd time. Of course, there are people who say modern Israel has nothing to do with ancient Israel, but the burden of proof is on them to demonstrate why that is the case. Because Israel is a Jewish state. It's the only Jewish state in the world. By comparison, there are 57 Muslim nations in the world. It is home to half of the Jewish people in the world. Its basic law, which is its constitution type agreement, is based on the book of Deuteronomy, and its national traditions are all Jewish. In fact, its flag is based on the Jewish prayer shawl that Jesus himself wore.
So I want to talk about the land that you mentioned. Just by looking at a map, am I too simple? When I look at a map, I see this tiny speck the size of New Jersey that's Israel, and the coalition of hostile or Muslim nations and dictatorships all around the land mass. So this is not, as you said earlier, it can't be about the land. And if if they're a bunch of occupiers, they're the worst at occupying that I've ever seen. Can you speak a little bit more about the land and why people can look at the map and still believe the propaganda and the talking points?
Israel is surrounded on all sides by people who are unfriendly or who are outright enemies. I counted this up one time, and Israel's fighting a war essentially on 7 different fronts at the present time. Now, when the nation of Israel was formed in 1948, the United Nations plan was there would be two nations formed, and a lot of people don't know this. One would be a Palestinian nation that would be for Palestinian Arabs, because up until the 1940s, anybody who lived in Palestine, which is what the Romans called it after they abolished the state of Israel, anybody who lived there would be Palestinian. But an Arab group decided, no, only Arabs can be Palestinians. Well, the United Nations said, okay, fine. Well, you establish a nation too. We'll give you Judea and Samaria, beautiful part of the country. It's the best land there. We'll give that to you. The Palestinian leadership refused to form it, and they've refused every time since in 1967, 2000, and 2008. Not only that, but they encouraged the Palestinian people, the Arabs, to rise up against the Jews and kill them. And 5 different armies came into that nation in 1948. No one expected the Jews to survive using the old Czechoslovakian weapons that they had, but they did survive. In fact, they were able to carve out the land for themselves and demonstrate that they can defend it. That's an important part of a nation. If you can't just to say this is now a nation, that the people have to be able to support it and defend it in order for it to be legitimate.
So going back to Genesis 12, how I don't understand how you can read, for example, I will make you a great nation, God speaking to Abram, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. In verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So it mentions, I will make you a great nation. And so now from our context here in North America, in the United States, when it comes to supporting Israel, does that apply to us in principle, that God will bless or maybe, protect America to a certain extent if we support or if we bless Israel? What do you think, Jeff?
David, I know a lot of people say that, and I have friends who are on different sides of that question. A very good friend of mine who's really good on worldview issues says, I don't believe that it's true that God, that God is obligated to bless America if we just stand behind Israel. And I understand that point. I think the larger point for Christians is really twofold. First, Galatians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul specifically references that covenant with Abram, later renamed Abraham by God, and says those who believe in Jesus are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. That what Abraham was given was the gospel. So God has formed a large nation of his people all over the world, some of whom are a tiny minority in the nations in which they reside. But this specific piece of land, we cannot be Gnostic about this. We can't say it's only spiritual. It is actually a physical reality, a place in history. The Jewish people are the only ones who have ever formed a nation state in that land. Jerusalem has only ever been the capital of one nation, and that is Israel.
So in chapter 9, we were running out of time. We have under 5 minutes already. I knew this would go by fast, Jeff Myers. Is Israel's war against Hamas just? Because the part of the argument is, do they have a right to defend themselves? And there's another, I think it's a chapter talking about the rape and death cult. That may have been a section of your book or a chapter. But you said in another interview, Israel has done more to protect the lives of civilians than any other nation in history. Who does that? Hamas doesn't care. They're killing civilians. Go ahead.
Yeah, don't take my word for it. That is from John Spencer, who's America's leading expert on protecting non-combatants in a time of war.
Yeah.
So this is part of the Christian tradition. If you want to understand a biblical worldview of an impossible situation, you have to understand what Scripture actually teaches. You have to understand the counterfeit worldviews that are at play. But then you also want to look back at Christian tradition, because there are Christians, in this case, Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, who brilliantly helped the world understand that even wars have rules, that any individual person cannot declare a war. It has to be a legitimate nation. They have to have a just cause. In other words, they have to have been attacked first, and then they need to clearly outline what their response is going to be. It can't just be, we're going to annihilate all of the people who are associated with our enemy. It has to be the attacking and destroying of that enemy. And then there are rules even there: military necessity, distinction, proportionality, those kinds of things. All of that is from the biblical tradition. So I go into detail about that. And everybody who goes to summit.org, you can go to summit.org/Israel, in fact, to get your free copy of the book. If you do that, you'll see there's a chapter on genocide, because that's the main accusation that's being made against Israel, that Israel's committing genocide. I look at those claims in detail and offer dozens of different pieces of evidence to show that that claim is simply not true.
Another chapter, the propaganda war, which we kind of touched on a little bit, how it's not just young people on college campuses that are already indoctrinated. If you go through the K through 12 and then go to university, oh my goodness. But it's kind of crept into the church too, this propaganda. And there's a poll on your website too, Jeff, at summit.org, that American voters are souring on higher education. My comment is, well, it's about time. I hope there's more, because that's a huge problem in America, just education. But so how can people get a free copy of this important book?
David, all you need to do is go to summit.org/Israel. I will send you a copy of the book. And when you get it, if you think that other people need to have that message, you can get back in touch with us and get more copies of the book. That is, the important thing is that we get the word out. I want believers to not be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies based on human tradition, based on the elements of the world, rather than Christ, Colossians 2:8.
Amen.
And so on this particular issue, I think this is a counterpoint to a lot of the things that we're hearing from the leftist progressives located largely in American universities who found common cause with this apocalyptic rape and death cult called Hamas.
And friends, you will also be curious to check out another very important topic on summit.org. Should Christians avoid politics? And it says debunking 4 myths that keep Christians sidelined. I really encourage you guys to check that out, because we've got too many believers that do not vote, that do not have a voice, and they're not loving their neighbor, I think, by just saying, all right, I'm not going to vote. We're not going to, because has supporting Israel is part of voting for what administration takes over in America. But that's for another time. Jeff Myers, thank you for your voice. Thank you for Summit and all the work you do. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you, David. Enjoyed being with you.
All right. Praise God. Guys, get this important book. Make sure you go to summit.org and please share it too. It's so important, and we're running out of time. God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.